We begin with the latest U.S.-backed peace talks between Ukraine and Russia. Day one of those talks was meaningful, according to a Ukrainian diplomat. Well, that's despite the two sides' widely divergent expectations and demands. Even as the talks were taking place on Wednesday, there were fresh reports of a Russian air attack on Ukrainian civilians and infrastructure. That in the eastern Donbas region that Moscow wants to fully control as part of any peace deal.
Productive is how Ukraine's top negotiator described the first day of fresh peace talks between Moscow, Kiev and the US. That's despite the Kremlin putting up an immediate hurdle, saying it would not end the war until Ukraine agrees to its terms. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed his people late Wednesday.
Overall, Ukraine's position is very clear. The war must truly be brought to an end, and Russia must be ready for this. Partners must also be ready to ensure this with real guarantees, security guarantees, and real pressure on the aggressor. It must also be felt now. People in Ukraine must feel that the situation is genuinely moving towards peace and the end of the war, not toward Russia using everything to its advantage and continuing attacks. The aggressor must not be rewarded. If any reward is given, Russia will eventually break any agreement.
But the situation on the ground suggested little progress toward peace. Russian forces, according to a local official, used cluster munitions to hit a market in the town of Drushkivka in Ukraine's Donetsk region. Several people were killed. Overnight drone attacks also struck multiple locations across Ukraine. Officials say Russia again targeted Ukraine's energy infrastructure, a pattern repeated each winter since the full-scale invasion began in 2022. The latest strikes hit thermal power plants.
The thermal power plants are under constant attack. Of course, this is a direct threat, a humanitarian catastrophe, a complete shutdown of the plant. The goal was the equipment that provides heating in the city. Everyone understood that the temperature was minus 25 degrees at night, and the ballistic missiles were aimed at the thermal boilers of this plant.
One of the harshest winters in years has pushed temperatures well below freezing. Millions of Ukrainians now depend on fragile power supplies, facing both the cold and continued attacks as the diplomats struggle to gain ground.
DW correspondent Nick Connolly joins us from Kyiv. So, Nick, what are Ukraine's red lines as it heads to day two of the Abu Dhabi talks?
I think they remain pretty much the same as we've seen over the last 6 months or year. I think this is about Ukraine saying we are not going to give up territory that we still control, that Russia has been unable to take on the battlefield. That means the Donetsk region, that is places like Drushkivka, where we had that attack yesterday with several people killed at the market. That is just political kryptonite for Volodymyr Zelensky. If you have all these troops asking after a potential deal, why did we stand in those trenches? Why were we risking our lives for years to then just walk away from territory? And I think that is exactly why Russia wants to force Ukraine into this kind of humiliating deal where it gives up territory that it still controls. I think there's also lots of questions that are basically unresolvable about Ukraine's future ability to join alliances, be that NATO or others, in terms of Ukraine being able to keep an army big enough to protect itself from a further Russian attack. These are all things that Russia is trying to chip away at, to claim that Ukraine somehow presents a threat to Russia's security by having an army that is big enough to protect itself. Obviously, people are talking up these talks. You know, the Ukrainian side doesn't want to anger Washington by being too negative, and that's why we're having these kind of unnamed briefings, often seeming quite positive. But in terms of the real hard work and the real kind of key questions, I'm not seeing any real sign that things are changing. We have heard diplomats, though, saying you'll basically not see any progress until everything is resolved, but that is obviously a very optimistic and kind of maximalist take on all of this.
And Russia is hitting both Ukraine's energy facilities and its civilians meantime. What impact is that having on Ukraine's approach to the talks in Abu Dhabi?
I mean, you can see behind me quite how cold it is here in Kiev. This is not a normal winter in Ukraine. It's pretty much the coldest winter since this war began. It's currently a bit warmer, and that means -5, -7, so we've got more snow coming in. Further freezing temperatures, even lower, -15, maybe as low as -20, expected in the next couple of weeks. It hasn't yet led to a kind of wider collapse in terms of Ukraine's infrastructure. We've had slightly chaotic outages, more kind of problems for ordinary people than normal, but there hasn't been a kind of overall collapse in the system. There were a few hours on the weekend where things went wrong for technical reasons because obviously the system is overloaded. But for now, it doesn't seem like the Russians have achieved that kind of level of collapse and kind of disorder in Ukraine that would then force Ukraine's politicians to sign away big concessions to the Russian side. That is obviously the hope from Russia, and that's why they're going to keep on doing these attacks while the temperatures stay so low.
Nick, President Zelensky, he said in an interview that 55,000 Ukrainians have been killed since Russia's invasion began. I mean, how is the public taking that number, especially against the backdrop of these talks?
So that came out in an interview with French media yesterday. I think it hasn't quite yet kind of reached people. That kind of headline was something we saw in the evening yesterday. I think there's a lot of skepticism about the numbers because, as Zelensky himself admitted, that doesn't include people missing in action whose bodies haven't been recovered. And lots of people think that that number could be as big or bigger than the actual official casualty numbers. There is a wide kind of consensus expectation in Ukraine that the number on the Ukrainian side is a lot lower than the Russian side because obviously defending is less risky than attacking, and we've seen the Russian tactics throughout being very willing to risk human lives kind of to throw people at Ukrainian positions, so there is an expectation that the Russian figure is significantly higher, but obviously for a much smaller population like Ukraine, that is massive. On top of the millions of people who've left the country as refugees, lots of young families left, that is a huge problem for Ukraine's demographic future, and this was a country that was already losing population and had an aging population before the war, so that is something that people are very worried about. But I think for now, people aren't really engaging with those numbers because the kind of stress of everyday survival means that people are just focused on one thing, and I think the real kind of accounting for what this war has cost, that will come much later once the kind of bombing, once the shooting has quietened down, has at least been paused.
DW correspondent Nick Connolly in Kyiv, thank you. Let's bring in our Riga bureau chief, Yuri Roshetto. DW has been reporting on Russia from there since we were banned from reporting inside the country. So, Yuri, from the Russian side, they have shown no willingness to compromise. Is there any indication that the Kremlin's position might soften?
Well, Sarah, we don't know exactly what was agreed on yesterday. Kremlin spokesman Peskov even said that Moscow has no intention of sharing any details in the future. So the Russian side is deliberately keeping quiet. Officially, they say it's to avoid jeopardizing the talks. But some political scientists see it differently. They say Russia isn't really interested in negotiating at all. It's a delaying tactic to buy time on the battlefield, especially in the Donbas, and to capture more Ukrainian territory. What's interesting, Sarah, is that the teams on both sides look very different from earlier rounds of talks. For example, half a year ago in Turkey, Putin's advisor Medinsky, a historian and a former culture minister known for giving long history lectures about who owns Donbas, led the Russian delegations. This time, it's Russian intelligence and military officials, the people actually in charge on the ground. So that could mean the chances of getting more concrete results are a bit higher.
And Yuri, I mean, Europe wants a seat at this talks. Moscow clearly doesn't want them there. Why is Russia so opposed to having the Europeans involved?
Well, yes, you're right. Europe wants a seat, and some EU leaders have been calling for a renewed dialogue with Moscow, alongside France and Austria, Latvia and Estonia recently suggested Europe should boost its diplomatic role, even by sending an EU special envoy to the Russia-Ukraine talks. Their logic, if Ukraine is talking to Russia, Europe should too. But the idea is controversial. Germany's chancellor, for example, rejects any talks with Moscow. And Russia, to your question now, yes, Russia has said from the start that it doesn't take the EU seriously and only wants to negotiate with the US on equal footing. Moscow considers Europe basically too weak, too undetermined, and Moscow also needs Europe as its enemy for its propaganda purposes. Also, Moscow refuses to accept any European troops or potential European troops in Ukraine as potential peacekeepers, arguing EU soldiers are basically NATO soldiers.
Just hours before the Abu Dhabi talks began, Putin and China's Xi Jinping held a highly publicized video call. What do you make of the timing of that, Yuri?
Well, indeed, instead of engaging with Europe, as I said, Putin spoke with China's President Xi, who not only called Putin my dear old friend, but also publicly backed his foreign policy. That might spark speculation about a possible Chinese role in the talks. Xi also noted that Putin's envoy Shoigu, the former Russian defense minister, had just visited Beijing to align positions on key geopolitical issues, as he put it. China has signaled from the start that it's willing to mediate between Russia and Ukraine. Beijing even released its own peace plan long before the Americans did, but Ukraine rejected as too pro-Russia. Again, we don't know what exactly Putin and Xi discussed, but the fact that Putin's close ally and former defense minister was recently sent to Beijing could hint that Russia might be considering some kind of Chinese peacekeeping role in Ukraine, but for now that's pure speculation.
DW's Yuri Richetto in Riga. Thank you.
Well, let's look into this with military analyst Marina Miron. Marina, one of the main obstacles is the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine there, as we just saw. What makes this region so important for Russia?
Hello, Gerhard. There are many reasons why the Donbas is important for the Russians. Politically, it is important because Russia has been claiming since 2014 that it is its duty to protect the Russian-speaking population of the Donbas. Economically, we know that the Donbas is the industrial heart of Ukraine with a lot of coal mines, and so a lot of Ukrainian industry depends on the Donbas for things like weapons production, metallurgical industry, and so on. And of course, we have to look at it from the Russian perspective of its aims of the quote-unquote special military operation. The Russians have to show, or the Kremlin has to show something to the constituent population in terms of achievement. And if you don't take the Donbas completely, then it becomes very problematic. And militarily speaking, and in geographic terms, it is a buffer for the Russians. It creates strategic depths. It secures the land corridor to Crimea, as we have seen how important it is during the Ukrainian counteroffensive in 24. So there are many reasons why the Russians want the Donbas, and they want to make sure that they have that buffer and the resource-rich land under their control.
Now, they don't have all of it. Why have Russia failed to capture the entire land?
Do we need to use the word failed? Because as of now, there is still no peace agreement, meaning that there is still a possibility that the Russians will be able to take more of the Donbas. So why didn't they get there up to this point is because the Ukrainian side has offered resistance. The Ukrainian side has been supported by Western allies, including the United States up to a certain point. And it's not easy. We're talking about positional war. And from what it looks like, the Russian armed forces were not prepared for the kind of war that they encountered after the initial phase of this operation, when a lot of the media outlets criticized Putin for failing to take Kiev in 3 days. And so the Russian forces had no plan at that point. There was no clear objective in terms of what they have to do. And so we have seen this adaptation throughout, but it is also very difficult in terms of terrain, in terms of Russian command, in terms of technological adaptation. So there are many factors that have led to this quote unquote slow progress. But as I said, in positional warfare, it's not maneuver warfare. It is by definition slow.
Now, the Kremlin said just today it will not back down and continue fighting against Ukraine and Kyiv until Kyiv agrees to Moscow's terms. What does this tell you about the chances that both parties could reach a ceasefire deal anytime soon?
The positions are diametrically opposed. And the problem here is that the Russians perceive their success on the battlefield as a determining factor, which gives them a stronger position in the negotiations. And that is coupled with the fact that Ukraine is no longer to count on the same level of US support as it had before. Ukraine is suffering from manpower shortage, and Ukraine also knows that European NATO members do not have the capacity to provide all the equipment that Ukraine needs straight away. And of course, where do you get the manpower? The recruitment is not going as planned, and officials inside Ukraine, including Kirill Budanov, said as much, and said it's not, just because of the Russian propaganda, it's also an internal problem that Ukraine needs to solve. And then we have the ongoing energy crisis. So Ukraine is in a very tough spot. And this is something that the Russians will seek to exploit in order to get Ukraine to agree to its conditions. President Zelensky is standing firm, saying that the Ukrainian constitution is not to be changed when it comes to the territorial question, and the United States are trying to mediate, first taking one side, then taking another side, because for the Trump administration, it is important to see some sort of an end to this because of the November elections. And so politically, it would be important for the United States to close this matter and move on with other foreign policy priorities. And therefore, I don't see how these negotiations could move forward. There could be an agreement on the exchange of prisoners of war, but I don't see how the territorial issue is going to be resolved, especially as Ukraine demands security guarantees and presence of NATO troops on Ukrainian territory, which is something the Russians will never agree to.
The military analyst Marina Miron there. Thank you, Marina.
Thank you for having me.